Welcome back. Now we've used our sewing machines for piecing, we're going to have a go at machine quilting. Machine quilting is much quicker than hand quilting. However, take your time to ensure your machine is set up properly, as unpicking machine quilting is a long and thankless task, as I've found out over the years. You may find it easier to practice on smaller pieces of work first, such as cushion covers, then work up to a large quilt. I've got two samples here of some machine quilting. On this quilt here, you can see we've just got straight lines going across it. And then on this quilt here, you can see I've been changing direction. These have both been sewn using a walking foot. So to start, I've fitted my machine with a quilting needle, and this is a strong needle that's happy going through all the layers. You can quilt with your jeans or microtex needle, but I find that particularly when I'm doing a lot of machine quilting, my machine is much happier with a quilting needle. This is a walking foot, also known as a dual feed foot or an even feed foot. It's quite big, so can look a bit scary when you first use it, but it's just like a regular foot, but it has feed dogs in it. Feed dogs are those teeth you have underneath the presser foot. They pull the fabric through as it sews. This foot also has feed dogs in it, so it takes the layers through evenly. It's essential for machine quilting as it stops the layers puckering. You can get some machines that have them built in, so look at your manual. However, this machine has a separate foot you put on. I've threaded the bobbin with machine quilting thread, and I'm using the same thread on the top and the bottom of my machine. Machine quilting thread is slightly stronger and often thicker than normal sewing thread, so it looks good when you quilt with it. I'm just going to place my walking foot on the machine, and to do this I have to remove a screw. So I've now removed my foot, put that to one side, and I'm now fitting my walking foot. The important thing is I'm putting the lever on top of my needle screw here, and that's what's going to help the feed dogs go up and down as I sew. I'm now just going to replace the screw. Right, I'm now ready to start sewing. So I've got a sample here, and to start I'm going to place my quilt under the foot of the sewing machine. Remember, when you machine quilt, as with hand quilting, we work methodically out from the centre towards the edges of the quilt. We want the quilt to stay nice and flat. Now turn the machine on, set the stitch length to your machine's shortest setting, then lower the presser foot, hold on to the thread from the needle, then lower and then raise the needle. I'm turning the wheel on this machine, however you might also have a handy button like I've got that has needle up and down. When the needle's raised, pull, and you're pulling the bobbin thread through, so it's exactly the same as when you start sewing, you want to pull the bobbin thread up. I'm now just going to pull that bobbin thread, and I've got that through to the front. I'm then going to put my needle back down, lift the presser foot and put my threads through to the back. This means that when we start sewing, the threads on the back aren't going to have a little party that might not look that attractive when we finish quilting. We know where they are, so they're going to behave. So now we take 4 or 5 stitches. Remember, it's on the shortest setting. And then I'm going to change the stitch length to 3. And then I'm ready to start quilting. If at any time I want to change direction, I stop with the needle through the fabric, lift the presser foot and just pivot. Lower the presser foot, and don't pull it too tightly when you do that. You don't want to move the needle. We want it to start sewing again from where we stopped. And then just keep quilting like this. When you get to the end, we're going to just reduce the stitch length as we did at the beginning. Take a few stitches, and that's going to anchor it. You'll notice my sample's got pins through it, and that's because if any get in the way as we're quilting, we can just simply stop sewing and take the pins out and then carry on where we're going. So here's my sample, and then I'm just going to trim the threads, and then that's all quilted. A tip for you if you're working on a large quilt is you can roll the areas, as it helps fit through this area of your sewing machine, so you can manage to get quite big quilts quilted on this kind of machine. Now before we sew the binding on, I'm just going to square up my quilt, and this means that we're going to cut the wadding and the backing level with the quilt top. Quite often I do this with my rotary cutter and my ruler because it helps to square it up again just in case it's shifted slightly when I've been quilting it. Now some people use this with scissors, but I quite like to use my rotary cutter and my ruler. You have to be careful about cutting the wadding with the rotary cutter, but it gives me a really nice square finish to my quilt. Now double fold binding gives an extremely strong edge to quilts, and it also adds a frame of fabric around the quilt so it looks good. Think carefully about the fabric you choose for your binding. It can frame your quilt, and some small prints can look great when sewn. We've got one here in red, and I've got a sample here where I've actually joined together offcuts from the quilt, and you can see we've got lots of different fabrics. So again, you can have some fun with this. So to prepare your binding, you need to work out how much binding you need to make. I usually add together the measurement of the sides of the quilt, and then I add 10 inches. And then you need to cut enough strips 2.5 inches wide to make this length of binding. It's possible you'll have to sew them together, particularly if you haven't got a quilt that's quite small like a table mat. They can be sewn together straight, so you just put them together, stitch and open up. However, I like to sew them together on a 45-degree angle as it's stronger. There's an easy way of doing this. So I've got my pencil and my ruler, and on these quilt rulers we have a 45-degree angle marked, which is really handy. So mark the 45-degree angle in pencil or a chalk pen on the wrong side of one of the strips of the binding. Line it up, right sides together with another strip like this. I'm going to place a pin in it just while I'm showing you how to sew it, just to hold it in place. We're now going to sew all the way down this line, and then we're going to trim this seam allowance after. There we go, it's been stitched there, and then I'm just going to trim the seam allowance. I've got the walking foot on my machine, which is perfectly fine to use for just sewing this line. Trim that seam allowance. I'm then going to take this to the ironing board. So next, take the strip to the ironing board, and at the end, whether it's straight or at an angle, fold it over and press. The next stage is where we've got the joins. We want to press these, and I press these open so they end up nice and flat. I press it from the front and then the back, and then I just trim these ears off so they don't get in the way. The next stage is to fold your binding in half and press it, and you need to do that all the way along your binding. So if you're making a long piece of binding for a large quilt, or if you're going to make your binding in advance and not use it straight away, it can help just to roll your binding around a pencil like this, and then you can store it and it's all ready to use. Now here I've got my quilt top trimmed to size, and I've got my binding all pressed and ready to go. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to put pins through it, which will just help to hold it in place. Now our 2.5 inch wide binding we're going to be sewing with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. What I've done is I leave my walking foot on the machine because we're sewing multiple layers, but we need to find a guide of where our seam allowance will be. So I've just done a few testers here. So both of these are with levels with the edge of the foot. So this is right with the very edge of the foot, and it's given me about a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is perfect, which is what I need. Now I'm going to start sewing a couple of inches away from the beginning. This is because when I get to the end, I tuck my binding back in. And I'm going to stitch all the way down to the end, but I'm going to stop 3/8 of an inch before the end. So what I'm going to do, using the guide on my ruler, is I'm now going to put a pin in there, here, and this would give me my stopping point for when I'm sewing the binding. You could also mark this on with pencil or chalk if you like. Now I'm starting on one side. On a large quilt I normally start about 2/3 of the way down, and then I'm just going to start sewing with my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm just removing the pins as I get to them. And now I'm level with this pin where I've marked in my 3/8 of an inch before the end. And I'm just going to do a reverse stitch to secure. Take the quilt from the machine and then lay it down and fold the binding away from the quilt like this, level with the corner, and that gives us a nice 45-degree angle here. Then what we're going to do is we're going to fold it over so that this is square with the edge of the quilt, and at this stage place a pin in it, and that's going to create our mitre when we stitch along the top. I'm just going to carry on pinning the binding, and then again I'm just going to put a pin 3/8 of an inch before the end, or a pencil or chalk line if that's what I'm using. And now we're going to stitch along straight from the edge, sewing over that mitre, and we're just going to carry on sewing all the way along with our 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When I get to about 4 inches before my starting point, I stop sewing and then I take the quilt from the machine. I tuck about 1 inch of the binding in, so I'm just going to trim the remainder here. And I'll just try it out, and then if I need to trim some more I can. And I'm just tucking that in, and I'm just going to pull it so that's nice and tight here, and pull it over. Then I'm going to put a few pins in it, and that's going to hold it in place. And then I just carry on stitching along here, and then my binding is finished and it's ready for me to turn to the back and hand sew. Okay. The last stage is to hand sew the binding to the back of the quilt using a slip stitch. We stitch along as we've done on the box project before, doing a slip stitch where we're making sure we don't go through to the front of the quilt, we're just sewing through the backing fabric and the wadding. And I'm just taking the thread directly behind where I'm coming out, and I'm using a white thread because I felt white was the predominant colour in the binding. I could have used a white or a black, but ideally for slip stitch you match the colour of your thread to the colour that you've got in your fabric that you're stitching. So, and I'm just covering the sewn line, and I'm just going to stitch along to the corner where I stopped to mitre. I'm just going to take one more stitch there just to anchor it, and then I'm going to fold this mitre. So I've stitched along, and then I'm just going to fold it back like this, and then slip stitch all the way along the other side. If I like, I can put an extra stitch just in this little fold here. Depends on your personal preference. I quite often like to just put a little stitch just in that mitre just to secure it, like so. I'm going to fold that over and just carry on stitching along the side. We have a neat corner, a very neat corner, and nice and square on the front. Because we've got 2 layers of fabric in this binding, it makes it really, really hard wearing, and it's a nice finish for a quilt. With the binding, you can also sew skinnier binding. You can cut your strips 2 1/4 inches, and then you can sew them on with a seam allowance of 1/4 inch, and remembering to stop 1/4 inch before the end to mitre. So do have fun with your binding. For many quilters, it's a really satisfying stage. The quilt starts to take on its own personality, and it means you're nearly finished. Play around with different fabric and colours for your binding. I often don't choose it until I finish quilting, as quite often it makes the final personality of the quilt. You might want a quiet spot, or you might want to be daring and use something bright and contrasting. I'm just going to sit here and carry on stitching round. This wall hanging is a quirky take on the traditional log cabin quilt block, which looks like this. On the version we're going to be doing, Here we're going to be using different width fabrics to make the centre fabric off centre. I've got the first sample that I did here, and I originally came up with this idea when I was playing with the strips that I was cutting off quilts after I'd quilted them before putting the binding on. The border strips are added on after, and it helps make it all slightly a little bit more wonky and off centre. Have fun choosing your motif for the centre. I've used a scooter motif here, but today I'm going to be using this lovely children's fabric. One of the great things about using a fabric like this is you can then match your colours from it. So I've used quite a daring colour palette, but it all comes from this fabric, so it works together. I like to hang things like this on the wall, and I would suggest buying curtain poles that have rings with clips on them if you want to hang quilts in your house. It means they can be taken down easily for washing, and you can swap them over quite quickly. Great if you want a quick change in a room or to hang up something seasonal. This project is quick to make, but take care over preparation, particularly labelling the strips, as this helps to speed up sewing. So I have here 5 fat quarters. I've got them to tone in with my fabric. If you've got lots of scraps and have been making lots of quilts, you could do this project with just offcuts like I did with my first project. I then have a long quarter, 25 centimetres off the bolt, and this is for my border. I've then chosen this pink fabric for my binding. I've got this lovely backing fabric, and I've got wadding, and I'm going to use white wadding as I'm using some white fabric. I've got 100% cotton thread for piecing already in my machine, and then I've got a pink thread that tones with my binding for my hand stitching at the end, and I've got machine quilting thread. I've got this lovely one with different colours in it, and these are called variegated threads. They can be really interesting to use. From my sewing box, I've got pins, I've got sharps needle for sewing my binding at the end, quilter safety pins, I've got scissors, and I've got a fabric marking pen. I've used a disappearing one, but you can use whatever you prefer. My strips have been cut with a rotary cutting set, however it is possible to cut them with scissors if you don't have a set. My machine's ready to go, and I've got my 1/4 inch foot on, and I've also got my walking foot handy for the quilting later. I'll also be using an iron in a bit. So preparation is key with this pattern. I've cut my centre fabric into a rectangle that measures 5.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And here I've prepped my strips. I'm just going to cut one more in front of you here. So I'm just going to trim the edge off this fabric. Then I'm going to turn it round, and I'm going to cut a 4.5 inch strip, which would be cut up for my border fabric. Now these are my border strips, so I'm just going to put it here and then cut it up in a mo. I now need to cut my strips to make my log cabin, and we're cutting a 1 inch strip, a 1.5 inch, a 2 inch and a 2.5 inch strip. And this bit's left over, and I might make some half square triangles out of this later. My border strips are here. I keep a lot of my fabric in sandwich bags when I'm cutting. They're really useful for keeping pieces together, and when you come to using them, you can just get them out. Now in this pattern, we want to use each one of these strips once round the edge. This will make sense when we start sewing. However, I have got instructions where if you want to recreate the colours being used so they're evenly distributed, you can follow that. Now for this, I've labelled them up with stickers. So I've decided this is fabric B, and I've put 1 inch just to remind me this is a 1 inch wide strip. So I've got my stickers, and this is going to be my fabric A. So that's my 1 inch, my 1.5, got my 2, and my 2.5. And this just means if I want to cut them and then sew again maybe next week, I can do my preparation in one session and then my sewing at another time. All seams in this project are sewn using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I've already set my machine up with the foot. Okay, so I've taken my centre piece of fabric and I've got my 2-inch wide strip of my fabric A, and then I'm going to place them right sides together like this, line them up, and I'm going to stitch along there with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, and you'll see how I've taken just a couple of stitches before and after. I'm now going to take this to my rotary cutter and I'm just going to line up and trim these ends off, so the strip at the bottom is level with the rectangle in the middle. Okay, so it now looks like this. And now I'm going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press it with the seam facing away from the centre rectangle. So now I've pressed it with the seams together but facing away from the centre rectangle, and I've now taken my 2-inch wide strip in fabric B and I'm going to place it on the left hand side of the centre fabric, and I'm going to stitch down that seam as I did before. And I'm now going to trim this with the rotary cutter and press it like before. So I've now pressed it with my seams facing away from the centre, and I'm now going to take my 1-inch wide strip in fabric C and I'm going to stitch that on to the top. And I'm now going to trim and press this again as before. So this is what it now looks like with 3 strips on. Now we've got 3 on log cabin, there's a nice little technique that we can use so we know which side should have the next strip. This side here has got 2 seams, but you'll see this one's only got 1 and this one. So we know each time we sew we want to attach it to the side that's got the 2 seams. Now keep sewing them on, repeating the stitching, trimming, pressing, stitching, trimming, pressing, until you've got all your strips onto the centre. So when you've sewn all your strips on, it ends up looking like this. And I'm just going to show you the back, and you can see how tidy it looks because we've pressed all the seams away from the centre rectangle. The next step is to take one of your 2.5-inch wide border strips, measure across your patchwork, and then sew a strip onto the bottom of it. So I've now sewn my border strip onto the bottom. Just a tip for you, when you cut this, you need to cut it from the very end of the fabric. Don't cut it from the middle of the strip, because the one strip will be enough to do both, but not if you take a chunk out the middle. So the next stage is to take your strips for your border, and you can see I've joined them together here. And what I've done is I've made it slightly longer, and then I'm going to measure it and I'm going to cut it so it fits on to here. I've put wider strips at each end because that just makes it a bit more helpful for when you cut it. If you had a narrow one, you wouldn't want to cut it and end up with a really, really thin strip. The layout of these is up to you. Play around, it's your quilt, and you decide how it looks. So I'm just going to go and press this, join it onto the bottom, and then I do exactly the same on the other side. Finally, we border the wall hanging in the same way, where we measure it, cut the strips to fit, and then sew them on. So here's my wall hanging, all ready for quilting. You can see it's been basted with pins. I've got my walking foot ready to put on my machine, and I'm using this thread. Remember the variegated thread I showed you? You can see it picks out all the lovely colours of the quilt. I'm now going to mark on my quilting design. I'm going to quilt it, and then I've got my binding all ready to go. Hope you enjoy making yours.